growing up in the 1970s may recall distant memories of a drug rehabilitation program called the Seed, an anomaly known only in a handful of American cities. Though mostly forgotten by the general public, the Seed was once the largest and most controversial of these self-titled rehabilitation centers, where parents were encouraged to send rebellious children suspected of using drugs. In recent years, anecdotes from those sent to the Seed paint a grim picture of the methodology and intentions of its founder. The lack of primary sources and unbiased accounts make it difficult to get an objective idea of its tainted history. So what exactly was the Seed, and what legacy did it leave behind? Arthur Robert Barker was born on August 3, 1924. There is little concrete knowledge about his upbringing. Commonly referenced as an incident in Mr. Barker's teenage years, when he was arrested for armed robbery and placed in the military before going AWOL. According to Mr. Barker, he was abusing alcohol around this time, and he joined Alcoholics Anonymous, where he became sponsor to stars like Jackie Gleason and Art Carney before leaving the organization. He claimed to have been clean for at least 17 years prior to creating the Seed. Details surrounding the Seed's founding are scattered. Some accounts claim Mr. Barker was working as a comedian at the Playboy Club when he began. He had a handful of bit parts in motion pictures of the day, such as the 1968 science fiction film Mission Mars. Around June of 1970, he established the Seed in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, with his wife Shelley out of their family home. The Seed was designed as a drug rehabilitation program for youth, taking inspiration from Alcoholics Anonymous. These youth ranged from the ages of 9 to 30, and the program is lauded as pioneering despite parallels being drawn to a similar program called Synanon. Synanon was later outed as a cult and dismantled. Mr. Barker used what he called behavior modification to repel youth from the vices of promiscuity and narcotics. Reports state that Mr. Barker had no formal experience working in education, instead holding a mail-order diploma in psychology. Mr. Barker was known for giving varying and often contradictory origin stories for himself and his organization. Early on, he sowed concerns of an imminent heroin epidemic coming to Florida, with the resulting paranoia providing an in to recruit more at-risk youth into his new program. Many parents were convinced with little or no evidence their child was in need of his services. This all took place during the summer of Manson, referring to the infamous Helter-Skelter murders, which had only exasperated moral panic and further justified the Seed's existence. Despite registering as a drug rehabilitation program, there were no doctors on the Seed's payroll. Mr. Barker was reluctant to allow psychologists in for observation, permitting only those who already agreed with him. The controversial psychologist Robert Dupont was one of his staunch allies, working to secure one of the first grants awarded to the Seed, worth $1.8 million. Funding provided a boon to Mr. Barker's organization, helping it grow in exposure and notoriety. The program had been featured on local news reports throughout 1971, exponentially increasing its popularity that year. Youth placed in the custody of the Seed became known as seedlings, and were taunted and harassed by staff for being what they called druggies. Mr. Barker appeared especially fond of the term, using it to describe his critics numerous times through the years the Seed was active. Seedlings were divided into old-comers and newcomers, with the latter group allowed considerably less freedom. First-hand accounts recall aggressive strip-searching tactics juxtaposed against seemingly inspirational slogans like, "You're not alone anymore." Support staff told students their attitudes sucked, while trying to pressure them into admitting their label as druggies. Use of the bathroom required adherence to their strict demands, and was almost never done alone. Seedlings were mostly fed a diet of Kool-Aid and peanut butter sandwiches. The morning routine involved what were called raps, where seedlings were told to air their drug use-related thoughts. Sleeping and daydreaming were forbidden, and students were forced to wake up their peers if they caught them. One account states the supervisor would chide students by saying, quote, "Hey, get out of your head." Raps were often a source of verbal abuse, with female seedlings being told they were headed towards prostitution if they didn't shape up. Males were called weak by their peers, with the girls in particular questioning their masculinity. Some students were forced to sing love songs in honor of Art Barker, whereas others had to entertain his high-speed rambling where he derided his opponents. Progress was not determined by any set timetable, but on a case-by-case basis assessing readiness. Most group therapy sessions consisted of screaming down a single individual before telling them how loved they were. Dissolution of identities was common, and members were encouraged to spy on one another. Relationships between seedlings were strictly forbidden. Many former seedlings recall increasing social isolation as their peers who are not in the seed gradually cut them out of their lives. Seedlings were not permitted to attend school or go home while in the program, and many of the staff members were themselves addicts and ex-cons. Physical abuse is a recurring mention in online accounts. Despite this, there are also a number of former seedlings on the internet who credit Art Barker with saving their lives, defending his practices in light of their extreme methods. Boasting of its success, the Seed stated it served at least 2,900 teenagers by February 1973. Curiously, it would almost double this figure in similar reports the following December. Wealthy families were thought to have gained influence within the organization, helping direct where later branches developed and how. This was colloquially known as the Seed Advisory Council. The council moved to build locations in Miami and St. Petersburg, Florida. Mr. Barker wanted to open a branch in every American city and had plans to build a settlement which would be called Seed City. Soon, legal authorities and judges from various Florida counties would sentence youth accused of the smallest infraction to do time in the Seed. Mr. Barker had made a few powerful allies endorsing the Seed, including Florida's Lieutenant Governor Tom Adams. Jackie Gleason donated a limousine to the organization around 1973, with the vehicle serving as a personal shuttle for Mr. Barker between home and the warehouse. A new branch in Stowe, Ohio was only open for a short period because of Mr. Barker's characteristic refusal to comply with inspections from the fire department. Though Mr. Barker consistently claimed his program had a 90% success rate, official records show this figure being closer to 41%. Legal documents state that members who left the Seed were often harassed by their fellow seedlings into returning through a tactic called peer group pressure. One social worker called the program, quote, a false ego trip for Art Barker to the utter destruction of his subjects. An article from 1974 dove into the specifics of the Seed, describing Mr. Barker as a fiery-tempered chain smoker with a caffeine addiction. Mr. Barker was especially derisive of the psychiatrist Dr. Raymond Killinger, who criticized the Seed because of how many students left it only to have nervous breakdowns. Dr. Killinger noted there were numerous suicide attempts by former seedlings. Later that year, the U.S. Congress opened hearings into the tactics used by programs such as the Seed, with conclusions likening them to North Korean brainwashing. Mr. Barker stopped accepting government grants by this point, complaining of what he called bureaucratic interference after oversight was insisted upon. It did retain its tax-exempt status, however. The Seed began relying more on donations and treatment fees, with the most expensive programs costing up to $8,000. By 1975, the demand for waivers to treat minors became a requirement for the Seed's licensing, which the secretive Mr. Barker was against. Fewer teenagers being involved bit into a considerable chunk of the program's demographic. The Seed also became known for covering up suicide attempts by seedlings, further weakening its reputation. Most Seed locations folded by October of 1976, driven by the bad publicity surrounding them. Notably, enrollment at the St. Petersburg location had plummeted, and the remaining students were transferred to Fort Lauderdale. The gap was eventually filled by another program offered through Straight Inc. Other programs of dubious reputation were often modeled off the Seed. Robert Dupont, one of the earliest backers of the Seed, later served as an advisor to Straight Inc. Art Barker ran in 1976 as a Democrat for Florida's 12th Congressional District, but had mediocre turnout and failed to make it past the primaries. The Cleveland, Ohio branch closed in October or November of 1978. Seedlings still attending this branch were shipped to Fort Lauderdale. The Fort Lauderdale branch continued to accept applicants as new seedlings through the 1980s, though at a considerably reduced rate from its heyday. Some anecdotes describe the group dynamic from this era as much closer knit. Attack therapy became a strategy reserved for defiant seedlings. In 1987, Mr. Barker resisted an eviction notice issued to the Seed in Broward County, as it was located on the site of a new interstate highway. By now, Mr. Barker had been out of the public eye for years and ignored most inquiries from the media. The next decade was quiet for Mr. Barker, but the Seed was not fully finished. It was a far cry, however, from the influence the organization once enjoyed. In October of 2001, Art Barker retired and closed the Fort Lauderdale Seed. This was the last remaining chapter, bringing a rather muted end to the organization. The following year, Mr. Barker divided up the remaining funds and donated $50,000 to Canine Companions, an organization training therapy dogs directed by former seedling Libby Kinzel, Art's adopted daughter. He kept a low profile from here on out and was in failing health. Then, on July 16, 2009, an online forum post included a supposed segment of an obituary from the previous day stating he committed suicide by self-inflicted gunshot wound. Supporting evidence of this is non-existent. Arthur Robert Barker more likely died in his waterfront condo on May 9, 2010, at the age of 85, as suggested by a publicly available obituary corroborating the few details known about the man. Despite an anticlimactic end to the organization, the Seed's legacy was felt in successors like Straight Inc., which became embroiled in high-profile controversy of its own through the 1980s and 90s. The Seed shows how people with good intentions can be turned against loved ones suspected of social deviance, and how the perfect storm of events can keep an ill-defined agency in a position of power for several years. Moreover, it is an example of how an obscure but highly contentious organization can simply disappear into the shadows, with survivors' anecdotes painting an image that will forever remain incomplete.